Welcome to our colleagues and friends here in the CAARI Library and online, and thank you for joining us for our lecture series. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nathan Meyer. Thanks to the generosity of the US Embassy in Cyprus, Nathan was awarded a special US Embassy in Cyprus fellowship this year. We have one more of these fellowships to distribute in the current fellowship round. The graduate student fellowships close tomorrow, so if anyone would like to very quickly lodge an application tonight, you can do so. And the senior fellowships close in 1 month, so you have plenty of time to apply there. Please take a look at our website at caari.org to see the opportunities we offer. Back to Nathan. Nathan undertook his MA in archaeology at Bryn Mawr, followed by a Master of Library and Information Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, which led to a career in information technology, strategy development, and enterprise program management. But he also stayed with archaeology and was awarded his PhD in anthropology at Berkeley in 2022, with a dissertation entitled Continuity and Discontinuity in Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age Cyprus. His research interests lie in the Mediterranean Late Bronze and Iron Ages, philosophy of archaeology, archaeological survey methodology, ceramics analysis, archaeological informatics and classification methodologies for archaeological material, research computing, and digital humanities. And he's currently the Digital Humanities Research Associate at the British School at Athens. In addition to his work and publications on archaeological informatics and methodology on a number of field surveys, including the Keros Naxos project and the Sydney Cyprus survey, he has published several articles on the Late Bronze Age to Iron Age transition on Cyprus, some of these jointly with Bernard Knapp, who is also here with us this evening. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Nathan for sharing his expertise and the help he has graciously given CAARI with our collections and library databases. So I now invite Dr. Meyer to present his lecture entitled Characterizing a Region with Archaeological Field Survey. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody here online for coming tonight. And on Thula, of course, thank you for the thankless task of doing the audio visual. I did. It's up all the way. Anyway, thank you, Thula. It's a very thankless task and very stressful, so I appreciate it. The last talk I gave here at CAARI had the improbable title of Data Literacy for Archaeologists. It was a very nerdy talk, and I had some real fears that it would be a failure. My genuine surprise, people actually got a lot out of the talk and actually enjoyed it. So rather than ascribe that to my presentation skills, I prefer to assume it worked as a talk because archaeologists are, after all, somewhat nerdy. And I say that with no offense intended and I mean it with the most affectionate way. So let's start the talk. Let's see if I can figure out how to make the mouse work. No. Okay, let's try this. Yeah, okay. So first, let's ask, why talk about field survey methods in 2024? After all, field survey is a mature practice with a long history of great projects that have broadened our understanding of the cultural past. As a practice, especially in the Aegean and also in the wider Mediterranean, extending as far as east and west, survey, often at 10-meter spacing, is something of a disciplinary standard. Pedestrian survey at even greater intensity is used on intrasite survey as well. And as archaeologists confront unique circumstances, they deploy additional methods, and increasingly remote survey and predictive modeling are making their presence known. So one could, from a certain perspective, have the opinion that field survey as a discipline is healthy and happy, with a dominant technique of 10-meter pedestrian survey, but other tools that are used as needed. However, survey data remains very hard to compare from project to project, and GIS-driven analyses continue to dominate despite acknowledged concerns about the data. In particular, the many ways that discovery of surface artifacts is complicated by various factors. So we have unresolved problems in a mature practice, but no concerted effort at this point to solve them. That's one of my areas of interest is in looking at that specific problem, a mature practice, but with problems. Let's look at field survey's journey. Prior to the 70s, it was extensive surveying, largely in the form of gazetteers. And then starting in the 70s, regional surveys really took hold alongside regional studies in general. And starting as well in the 70s were debates about methodology. Those debates were quite robust leading into the 80s and even into the early 90s. In the 1980s, we saw a trend towards increasing intensification of survey methods. So increasing effort applied on smaller aerial expanses. And by the early 2000s, problems with comparability were starting to be talked about in earnest. At the same time, you started getting into surveys that were micro regions versus regional, and even intra-site survey. Coming up from a completely different sort of orientation was this notion of remote survey via remote sensing, which led to another newer round of extensive survey. The net result of all of this, and we'll talk about this more, is that pedestrian survey became something of an atheoretical disciplinary habit. That's a quote from Michael Given, and we'll talk about Michael's work a bit more. So the question I ask is, can we and should we, excuse me, one sec. Can we and should we try to bring these back together in a super site survey methodology? Okay. Let's talk about Michael's critique of field survey. The nature of that critique is that while field survey remains a valued tool, especially in cultural heritage management, it has underperformed as a tool in research archaeology. Givens argues that the processualist intellectual framework remains unexamined and that we seem to have gotten comfortable with that. And here I quote, "It's become an unquestioned and atheoretical disciplinary habit." Though I'm largely in agreement with Given, whose work I greatly admire, I am hopeful that someday we'll be an archaeology without labels and say goodbye to the othering terms such as processualist. Simply stated, we need an archaeology that uses the right methodological and theoretical orientation to accomplish the task at hand. It's not surprising then, given the topic is regional survey, that when Given turns to interventions, he singles out three variants of systems-oriented thinking. One is human ecology, infused with a Deleuzian concepts such as assemblage, which are human, non-human, material, and immaterial participants, and rhizomes, decentralized and non-hierarchical networks. His second intervention is complex adaptive systems theory, which emerged at the same time as Deleuzian thought, but from a systems thinking versus an ontological thinking perspective. The approaches share concepts of assemblage, emergence, rhizomatic-like networks, and nonlinearity. And then there's Given's own conviviality, which differs from Deleuzian thought and complex adaptive thinking, systems thinking, primarily in Given's emphasis on the political and ethical dimensions, a thread in Given's work that I think we all have come to appreciate over the years. So the question there is, can we rise to Michael Given's challenge? So en route to the challenge, en route to his challenge, I think two challenges in the way. On the one hand, data from surveys continues to be problematic from a quality, consistency, and comparability perspective. And while comparability issues need not get in the way of Given's aims, quality and consistency certainly will. On the other hand, we have these diverse methods, each of which can contribute to the whole, but disconnected from each other. And if we accept Given's critique, as a group, they are under-theorized. You might, however, be wondering how the fact of multiple disconnected methods stands in the way of Given's aims. Well, there's a paradox. Fundamentally, Given's argument rests on ecosystemic thinking, and thus, and with no way around the need, it requires a human ecology data set, or at least the best version of that we can create. To truly get a full data set, or at least a very high quality sample, however, is difficult because it requires, amongst other things, full coverage to find rare sites, intensive, aka expensive survey to find small sites. And already we see we have a problem. How do we achieve full coverage while being intense? We also have to seek out locations of specific cultural valence, regardless of accessibility or visibility conditions. We have to overcome, or at least understand, the challenges posed by depositional and erosional processes in the landscape. And so paradoxically, we have to do all that with limited resources. I would thus submit that to achieve our best version of the complete data set, we need careful allocation of resources and a thoughtful methodological approach. So what's a possible solution? If I'm correct that we need carefully thoughtful, then we have to consider the following. Spend less energy on getting broad understanding of periods and lifeways of a region, less energy on characterizing dense concentrations of artifacts, less energy on pursuing systematic survey of landscapes with difficult accessibility or poor recovery potential, and then spend more energy on purposeful search, targeting locations drawn from theory-informed models of past human activity, including theorized rare but important sites, exploring high potential areas with higher intensity to discover smaller sites, and overcoming difficult visibility where it really matters. And by that, I mean where we're actually trying to discover the important and rare at the site. Finally, tie all these together in a thoughtful multi-stage survey approach. Okay, so now we're going to shift from talking about the premise here to talking about the simulation I have created. And it's a work in progress. It's programmed in the Python language, and it's an evolving set of concepts. We're not going to discuss the technical design of the simulation at all. If you are interested, we can talk about that at a later time. And we will also not explore important parts of the tool that are in place, but we don't have time tonight to discuss, like statistical tools to understand the structure of the data we are recovering. So variations in density and clustering by period and landform. These are in the tool, but still under development. And we will also not look at massive numbers of iterations of the survey simulations, as my poor laptop sometimes takes 24 hours to run some of the more complicated models. And finally, a note on the density figures that I'll be using throughout the talk in the simulations that I've been programming. These numbers are drawn from published surveys, and I explore the different densities as a way of trying to figure out if there's specific density related issues that might affect recovery. Okay, so let's get into the tool. So a simulation, of course, needs an imaginary landscape, and this one is 5 by 17 kilometers, and it has a mix of different landforms. Here you see an alluvial plain in yellow, lowland hills in orange, an upland plateau in light green, a large eroded set of hills in gray, and then a forested hill in dark green to the left. Nothing we're going to talk about tonight involves the forested hill. There's other versions of simulations I have that do, but it's not part of what we're talking about tonight. You can see a village in bright orange there. And then there are also different kinds of waterways. There's dark blue for perennial river, large dashes for a seasonal but large scale river, and small dashes for seasonal tributaries or erosional cuts. Travel ways are represented by modern tarmac roads in large black, and then dirt roads in smaller black, and white dashes for footpaths. And we'll talk about how those play in a bit later. What you cannot see here at this scale are resource features such as workable flint outcrops in the central hills and springs in the lowlands. Okay, a little bit on spatial structure and artifact recovery. So it is true that we don't sample artifacts or sites, we sample space. And spatial arrangements of artifacts, density, clustering, degree of clustering, differences across landforms, periods, artifact densities, these all impact recovery. And we don't know when we start out what the spatial structure of the artifacts in the survey space we're looking at is. And we won't know until we do some work in that area. So given that we have to discover the spatial structure and that we want a representative sample of artifacts, at what intensity will we be able to do those two things, discover the structure and get a representative sample? So to talk about that, we're going to look at 5 different simulations tonight. One of them is an offsite scatter of offsite scatter simply placed randomly in the landscape. The second one is a systematic clustering of these offsite scatters. Then there's a non-weighted placement of offsite and site artifacts. So it's not weighted by anything, it's just random. Then there's a weighted placement, which is still random, but it's weighted towards being placed closer to relevant cultural or resource features. And finally, there's a very low offsite artifact and a very high degree of cluster, again weighted. And you'll see as we go through this how these things relate to each other. All right, so these pictures, I think they're pretty visible actually, here in the room at least. These pictures at left, we see the random placement. So although it looks like it's kind of all sort of even, it's not. If you zoom in, you'll see there's blank spaces, there's places where there's more sherds or less sherds. That's about 2.5 kilometers that you're looking at there on the left and on the right. And on the right, you see this systematically clustered artifact distribution. So these clusters are created through a process of building these polygons across the landscape, and then the artifacts are laid into the polygons and they're clustered towards the center. So you get blank spaces around the edges. That mimics a kind of gently contoured wave of artifacts. Okay, so at different spacing of transects, you would wonder then, will these differences in how those artifacts are laid down, will they cause variation across different levels of intensity? So we're going to look first at the random layout of offsite clusters. So the first thing to notice is at the top left, you have about 470,000 artifacts. Hold on one sec. Stuck. Now look at the effort. You see here what you would sort of expect to see is that as you move from 5-meter spacing to 50-meter spacing, you have a drop in effort, logical, right? At 50 meters, you're using 1/10 of the effort than you would be at 5. All right, so then the first interesting observation about the artifacts is that all the intensity levels overestimate density to a similar degree. Well, this is interesting because you often read in survey literature that surveys underestimate density. But I can see clearly in this simulation that that's not really the case. The landscape actually has 1 sherd per every 155 square meters, but the simulations all center on 1 in 55. They're all the same across all those intensity levels. Now, if you look at the representation of periods in the landscape, you can see that all the intensities do a good job of reflecting what is really there. When you look at rare periods, you see a bit more meaningful variation, but still nothing is really glaring. So in this random configuration of offsite artifacts across the survey universe, okay, and we can get into more details about how what periods are where and so forth, but just staying at that level for now, you see that all 4 intensities do an equally good job of tracking what is actually in the landscape. Okay, let's look at another one. Here's the systematic clustering. So again, it's not random, it's systematically clustered. And the first thing you see again is that you would think, because it's clustered, that maybe the 5-meter and 10-meter would have represented things better than the 25 and the 50. Yet we get the same sort of similarity here. I'm also showing on this slide the functional data from the ceramics. Now, what we're looking at here is functional data non-specific to a period across all the periods. I have data that breaks it down by period, but I'm not going to show that tonight. But what you see is, again, incredible consistency on how all four intensities are figuring out functional periods in the data, in the ceramic data. So what we're seeing is that there's no one pedestrian mode that is more effective at characterizing these simulated landscapes. Okay, so now we're going to look at two more. At the left, you see a random offsite scatter and one small cluster. So the clusters actually represent period-specific or mixed period clusters of artifacts. They have a more dense core and a less dense halo, and then it fades back into the offsite background. On the left, it's not weighted, it's just random. So that little dot showed up there just randomly, okay? On the right, it's clustered. And it's clustered according to sort of affinity with resources in the landscape. So footpaths or rivers or flint outcrops or springs. So the sherds and the sites are being placed in the landscape with an affinity towards these environmental factors. Okay, so what do we see in the data? Oh, and then just on the, you can't see it much at all, but there's an image on the bottom left of what it actually looks like. You got a pink core, around it is a brown halo, and then the green stuff is all scattered around it. That's the background. Okay, so you might think, okay, now we're getting a more complex structure in the data. We're going to start seeing differences in how these four survey methods are sampling that data. And the truth is, we don't. We see pretty much exactly the same thing. So again, on artifacts per meter, they're incredibly consistent. On artifacts per effort, they're incredibly consistent. Even rare periods here, the medieval, geometric, and prehistoric, they do a very good job of tracking that data, and they're all consistent. And in rare functional classes here, cultural, religious, and industrial classes, very, very rare in the landscape, but they're still being tracked by all four methods. So we've now looked at four really different ways of structuring the artifacts in the landscape. So we'll look at a fifth one now. This time I show it at the level of the region. And again, the forested hill is not in this set of simulations. I show this at the level of the region that we're looking at. And you can see by looking at the picture a couple of things. First, you see all the clusters. There's 338 of them, okay? You can't see them all because some are very small. Then you also see in the landscape, you see that the intensity of artifacts in the different landforms varies a lot, right? You have very little artifacts in the central hill. You have increasing number in the western uplands. You have more in the lowlands that surround the central hills and often the bottom right-hand corner. And then you have the most in the alluvial plain. What you also see is that because we're clustering, you're seeing artifacts tracking to these resource features. So you can see that dark line is the perennial river running through the alluvial plain. You can see another line kind of vertically coming down on the left-hand side that reflects the seasonal watershed. And then where those two intersect at the bottom left, you see kind of an intense gray spot where artifacts are clustering into that spot. And you can kind of pick out features even by looking at where the sites are plopping in. They're following the rivers and they're following the paths. So they're clustering in a way that simulates how people in the past would locate themselves in space, okay? So again, as I'm doing this over the months that I've been doing this, I'm like, every time I build a new simulation, I'm like, this is the one where I'm finally going to see that it's different. It's finally complex enough that the simulation will show a difference, and it doesn't. So again, artifacts per meter, incredibly consistent. Artifacts per effort, incredibly consistent. Discovering rare periods, they all do a pretty good job. and discovering rare functions. They all do a pretty good job. You do see here, and I think this is related to the intensifying clustering, you do see that in the geometric period, you got a steady decline from 5 meters to 50 meters, but it's not so much that it would sort of convince someone to spend 10 times the energy to change that data. All right, so are you having doubts? Because, I mean, if I was sitting in your chair, I would be having doubts, right? Okay, so I think it's good that you have doubts, and I think it's actually, it's right on, it's appropriate, right? So again, if I was sitting in the audience seeing these, I would be thinking, there's something going on here that I'm not quite understanding. And that's what I thought when I first started running these simulations. I kept being surprised. So people who are really well versed in statistical analysis, perhaps maybe somebody in the audience or out on the internet, they're probably not at all surprised. So for those who are in doubt, there are 3 ways to address that concern about whether this is a fluke, whether there's something wrong with the simulation program that's somehow flawed. So the first way to address that is to say that though they're minor, we do actually see variations according to intensity and according to degree of spatial clustering or spatial structure, I should say. So that indicates that we're getting real signals from the data. If they were all the same, you know, bing, 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 all the same, I would be, yeah, there's definitely something wrong, but they're not. They're different, it's subtle, but they're different. So that indicates that we're seeing real data. More convincingly though, and I won't have time to show you this tonight, but we can talk about it in question and answers. At lesser spatial extents, we do see different behaviors of the various intensities. So for example, when you drill down to a 200 by 200 meter square, you will see incredible variety in how the different methods are behaving. And the interesting thing is, again, intuitively, you would think, yeah, that makes sense because there's less data for them to sample. So it's going to be more variability in what they do sample. But my money is on 5 meters being the one that's going to be the most accurate. And you'd be half right and half wrong. You do see incredible diversity in the 200 meter blocks, but you don't see 5 meters being uniformly the best performer. In fact, randomly, all of a sudden, the 25 meter one will be the best performer. And it all depends on how the transects are intersecting the data in that 200 meter block. So, and again, we won't look at it today, but I've started exploring how, when you drill down into the landforms more discreetly, does it start to break down? And again, I was sure that once we got down to the landforms, there'd be less data, we start to see differences, and so far, I don't see differences. Okay, so at a regional scale, sufficient systematic sampling, even of low populations like the prehistoric and the geometric period in this simulation, will tend to reveal their true representation in the population. So again, even though the prehistoric and geometric periods represent small fractions, very small fractions of the total amount of sherds, because we are systematically sampling all the landforms, we get enough of those periods to converge to their true value. So said in another way, and it'd be fun to do this sometime, we could have a little graph on a little set of numbers on the screen, and we could run the simulation. And if you stayed for 24 hours, you would see the numbers start to change. So at first, you'd have these percentages that were all over the place, and they would have no relationship at all to the true data in the survey area. But as time went on, they would all start to converge to the true representation. So by the time you get out to a lot of sampling across the survey universe, you start to converge on the true representation of what's out there in the survey universe. Okay. So a working hypothesis then. For field survey, systematic sampling is our greatest ally. There's been a lot of, in the history of field survey, there's been a lot of different techniques for probabilistic sampling and so on and so forth, stratified sampling, so on and so forth. I think it's pretty clear that systematic sampling is really our ally. Even at 50 meters, we end up with enough data to get to the real truth of the shape of the data. Even with diverse spatial structures, we achieve a consistent big picture. We've been talking about that, so I won't say more. The rare periods are represented, even though they are so rare. And part of that is because of the complementary nature of the data. So think of it this way. If you have in the alluvial plain, you have very large early Roman, late Roman sites with lots and lots of data. You're going to hit those, whether you're at 5 meters, 10 meters, 50 meters, and you will get enough data to get a true representation. But when you have small sites, like here in the geometric one, and we'll talk about this more in a sec, you're going to miss them, okay? But you might miss the cluster, but you might hit the halo. And if you don't hit the cluster or the halo, you'll hit enough of the offsite scatter to slowly start to converge back down to the true structure of the data. So a working hypothesis here is that, okay, so wait, first open question is, I haven't done this yet, but I'm going to, is that at what intensity would the data fall apart? Is it 75 meters? Is it 100 meters? Is it 200 meters? Probably it's certainly by 200 meters. You'll see it doesn't converge because you're just not sampling enough to get that convergence. Okay, but what about finding sites? Okay, the last article I wrote on survey was entitled Finding Sites. And it is something I do actually believe. But right now we're talking about this sort of non-site approach to the data. So if you're thinking to yourself, okay, maybe that makes sense. You can use low intensity to get some kind of general sort of picture of things, but that won't work for finding sites. And you're in fact, you're right to a degree. So here's a picture that shows of the 338 clusters across 100 repetitions. So I ran the survey simulation 100 times to generate this data, okay? And we'll talk first about the size of the clusters. So you see 100% of them are equal to or over 3 meters, okay? Right away, you should go, oh, okay, that means that 5 meters is going to get them all, because if you're walking a survey transect and you're looking 1 meter to either side, and you have a partner who's over to your right also doing that, there's a 3 meter gap, okay? So you're going to probably find those sites. And of course, what you do see is that, 5 meter will find all the sites. At 8 meters, 87% of the clusters are equal to 8 meters, 97% of the halos are, and you can see the numbers that go out. The thing to draw attention to is that 84% have a halo that's equal to or more than 23 meters, okay? That wasn't how I planned that. That's just how this came out when I punched in parameters, okay? Clusters, there's very few that are equal to or greater than 48 meters. So 50 meter transects are not picking up a lot of clusters, okay? There's just not many out there to pick up. But 42% of the halos are that big. So it's getting something of that site, okay? And then we see the ranges, between 3 and 7, 8 and 22, 23 and more. Again, you see most of the halos are more than 23 meters. So here's the discovery rates by size. So now we're looking at what will 5 meters find, 10 meters, 25, 50 meters. Of course, 5 meters finds everything. And 10 meter does really well. It even gets 86% of those small sites, okay? 25 meters, it starts to fall off pretty quick. And at 50 meters, you're not finding very many of those small sites at all, okay? 25 meters, 34% of those small sites, you probably are overcoming any real diversity of small sites. So if you had small sites that were all just incredibly different from each other, different processing activities, different cultural activities, at 25 meters, you're picking up 30% of those, or better than 30%. and you're probably getting a sample that overcomes that diversity. But at 50 meters, you're not, for sure, okay? So is this a problem? In the context of given this challenge that we have to do something other than just do processionalists, put the dots on the map, is spending 20% of the energy, so 50-meter spacing, a good trade-off here, okay? And the answer is it depends. If you believe or have knowledge that you don't have a lot of diversity in those small clusters, then absolutely it's a wonderful trade-off. But if you suspect or know that you do have or could have a lot of diversity in those small clusters, then it's not worth the trade-off. What do we do if that's the case? Do we just do the 10-meter thing and call it a day? Or is there another way to go forward? So what I'm interested in studying and looking into more is redirecting our energy, okay? So here's an estimate of how much actual people time you're saving when you do 5, 10, 25, or 50-meter survey. Okay, it's not just the survey, which is fairly easy to calculate. So this represents a walking speed of 3 kilometers per hour, which I would submit is pretty generous for a field survey. But let's say 3 kilometers per hour. At 3 kilometers per hour, you're saving 243 person days by doing 50-meter over 10-meter. Okay, 243 person days. That's a 10-person crew working for 4 weeks, 6 days a week, okay? But it doesn't stop there, of course, because we bring all that stuff back to the field lab and people have to read all that pottery. So with a highly efficient 350 sherds an hour, I don't know if anyone wants to react to that as being a number that they achieve on their projects. Yeah, but at a highly efficient rate, which is based on reading groups, maybe using the chronotype system if you wanted to get on the bandwagon. If you had a highly efficient pottery reading process and you brought back 25% of the sherds that you encountered, you're going to save another 68 person days. So between the field transects and the pottery reading in this highly efficient world we have, you have a 311 person days to redirect. Okay, so now it starts to get interesting. If I can get a really good representation of the survey universe by walking at 50-meter spacing, and I save 311 person days in my little imaginary survey universe, what do I do? Okay, so let's finish up. We're at 39 minutes, I think it's just in time. So let's talk about caveats and warnings first, because I tend to get enthusiastic about things, and then I have to kind of rein myself back in and think about it from the other side, so to speak. So a simulation is not the real world. For this to be useful to us, we'd actually have to test it really in the field. Okay, so the ideal thing in my mind would be to run a survey that executes a very standard, consistent with today's practices methodology, but at the same time runs a parallel effort that says, well, what if we did it at 50 meters? And then what if we started targeting these specific areas in the landscape? Would we end up with a better, worse, same, more effort, less effort? Our environments vary. So different landscapes, forested versus arid, etc., they require adaptive strategies. The way the simulation tool is set up is you can put in all kinds of parameters to basically mimic what you think is the structure of the data in the area you work. Okay. We didn't talk about it, but there's also ways to simulate visibility issues and so forth. Okay. So environmental variability we have taken into consideration. The tool is set up to handle that. Redirecting effort risks failure. Well, as far back as 1984, John Sherry talked about one of the reasons why the pedestrian survey model was so effective or so useful, I guess I should say, is because it was really easy to set up and operate. And they did a lot of work making it easier in terms of tools they built to use in the field, and so forth. And so it's easy and you can do it and you probably won't make many mistakes unless you're not thinking about quality issues, which is a whole different topic that we're not going to talk about tonight. So if you decide to redirect effort, you now risk failure. And unless you have a really thoughtful approach to using that effort, there's a good chance you might actually end up with worse results than a standard 10-meter spacing. This next one is interesting. The simulation right now doesn't consider intra-site structure. So on small little clusters, it's not going to be an issue. But on large clusters, multi-period sites, you're going to have variability in periods across the cluster. And you're likely to have variability in functional classes across the cluster too. But right now, the tool doesn't deal with that. But that's something I want to build into it. And then there's balancing theory and practice. So theory also always has to be at the service of practical archaeological work, ensuring the approach yields actionable and meaningful insights. This simulation, this way of thinking about survey is only useful if it provides good information at a lower cost or better information at the same cost. If it doesn't, it's not worth it. So the next steps, of course, would be to find out if it does in the real world. So, okay, those are scary warnings, but they're important to make sure that we talk about the caveats and the limitations. But what the simulation is telling us so far is that, excuse me, what the simulation is telling us so far is that a 50-meter spacing can give us a good first approximation of the periods and functional classes in the landscape. At 50 meters, we picked up really small numbers of sherds from rare periods and rare functional classes, but we got them. And we were able to see that it correlated well to what was actually in the data. So the understanding of spatial structure, the difference between landforms, differences in densities, clustering, period and functional representations can orient and drive targeted use of resources. So here, the analysis of spatial structure of the data would lead us to do far less work sampling across broad areas that we already can tell from the structure of the data are less likely to give us new information, and we could redirect our resources to areas where we have questions. So we're seeing the structure of the data is telling us that there's more hidden information here that we haven't discovered yet. Okay, so what would recommendations be? The first thing I want to say is that GIS, I use it all the time, by the way. I'd use GIS all the time. That's what you saw here on these maps. It's good for visualization. It's useful, and it's a disciplinary norm. But the fact is that we're using it without really knowing the quality of our data. And we create pictures that we then put in publications that we can't really testify to the quality of the underlying data. Statistical analysis is required to actually understand the spatial structure of the data and to direct further investigation. So we're publishing maps that we don't really know the spatial structure of, but we have the tools and statistical tools that are available today to actually understand that structure. And time will be saved, time saved will be time lost without using those tools. Okay, nothing's going to replace hypothesis-driven field survey. The fact is that even though it may not be front and center in everyone's publication, the truth is that the work that they're doing is driven by a hypothesis about what the landscape is, what's happening in the landscape. And almost all surveys that I've read, if not all of them, have teams that they send out to do special tasks in the landscape. They can call them architecture teams, or they can call them special search teams. On one project, a friend of mine told me the story anecdotally. They were called the Schliemann team. So there's always teams that go out in landscape and kind of crawl around, not doing consistent transect work, but targeting areas, okay? The only thing is we're not doing that in a very formal way, and we're not doing it driven by a theory. We're doing it kind of on hunches and things like that. And that's okay, but what I'm arguing for is let's acknowledge that and let's formalize it. So my last recommendation here is that this combination of a kind of new version of way of thinking about extensive survey, combining that with hypothesis-driven and model-driven intensive survey deserves more disciplinary attention than it's currently getting right now. And that has been the reason why I'm doing this work, is I think it has potential, and I'd like to get us to kind of start thinking about it collectively as a discipline. All right, so with that, I just want to say thanks again to Lindy and CAARI, and thank you all for showing up and coming, and I'm happy to take any questions. We should be able to end slideshow, stop sharing.